Good evening, everybody. I'm going to give this just a few moments here for people to get into the room, get a chance to say hi. Well, good evening. I am Reg Hoyt. I am the chair of the One Health Working Group here at Delaware Valley University. I'm also the co-chair of Animal Biotechnology and Conservation. We welcome you to, this is our 5th seminar of the spring. We've got one more seminar coming up at the end of April. We hope you'll join us for that. For those of you who have not been to a One Health seminar, let me tell you a little bit about One Health, at least from the way that we view it here at Del Val. I think probably the simplest way to put this is that we're all on one planet. We're all in this together. And our future is really inextricably linked. Actions that we as a human society or us individually, the actions that we take have repercussions, whether they're positive or whether they're negative. And the problems that we face in the world, particularly the one you're going to hear about tonight, are very multifaceted and need to be approached from a transdisciplinary approach. One of the first things that I ever learned when I entered my professional career was, I don't know everything. And I wish that many of those courses that I didn't think were very valuable were something that I'd paid a lot more attention to. I find that I need to have some knowledge of economics. I need to know plants. I need to understand how people think and how society works. I even have to get involved in politics, which, oh my God, scary stuff. So at Del Val, we've been pursuing this now for almost 7 years, and we kind of approach it from 2 points of view. If I can get the slide to change here. Oh, we go back. We approach it from education. So within our first year, our students get introduced to the One Health concept in Del Val 2. They also get introduced to it in a number of courses within our English department and other places, certainly within my courses. We see that, the world is not made up, even though we tend to build them, it's not really made up of silos, that we need to be crossing over and talking with others. And Del Val is small enough, and it's always been about the land, so it's easy for us to actually interact with each other. Our working group consists of faculty from all areas of the campus, not just from one area or another. And so this is a great opportunity for research with the faculty or with students as well. And then there's outreach, and we really see ourselves as being part of the community. We've got some community partners here tonight who are co-sponsoring this event. And so these seminars give us a chance to have our community get engaged with what's going on here at Del Val, for us to learn new things, and maybe form some new partnerships for the future. So I'm going to be putting a few things into the chat box as we go along here. One of them is going to be, how can you learn more? There is a link there at the bottom of this slide. So this link takes you to where you can register for upcoming events. It also has recordings of past One Health seminars going back several years, and we'll include the recording from this evening as well. So it's a treasure trove of information. In addition, I'm going to put a link in the chat that's going to be from our library. Claire Drullett and the library staff have done an amazing job of bringing together piles and piles of information related to all of our One Health topics. And the library has an amazing collection of books that kind of support this interest in a more global point of view, a more holistic kind of point of view. So I hope you take advantage of that. And when we wrap up this evening, I also, and while in the chat, I will be asking for your help. For those students and for many of our community members, you're very familiar with A-Day And A-Day is upon us. So that's a weekend near the middle, well, not the end, but not quite the middle of the month, in which, well, the whole campus becomes a county fair. We are going to be presenting Outreach, a traveling exhibit from the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum. And that will be open to the public during A-Day. And we hope that you'll come visit us. And you students, I need your help. So please sign up. I'm going to put a link in there so that if you'd like to sign up for some time with us, you can do that. And now I'm going to stop talking and hand it over to Shannon, who's going to tell you a little bit about the Heritage Conservancy.
Thank you, Reg. Thanks to DelVal and Reg for having us join in as a co-sponsor this evening. I'm Shannon Friedeboss-Siller with Heritage Conservancy. We're a local nonprofit that serves Bucks and surrounding counties, and we work to protect land and historic places. So we've been around since 1958, and we've helped to preserve over 16,000 acres of open space, farmland, wildlife habitat, and important watershed areas throughout this region. Additionally, each year we host over 100 volunteer, community, and educational programs. Now, throughout some of those programs, we work with volunteers to remove at least 1,000 pounds of trash from our own preserves each year. Trash that is either dumped, washed in from rain and flooding, blown in by the wind, left by visitors, and so on, with over 32% of that trash being plastic items. So you'll see a few examples of our trash cleanups and then some of our watershed education on this slide. So we're working to try to cut down on this plastic pollution that's occurring at our local scale. And over the last few years, we've been engaging community members of all ages in conversations about the impacts of those single-use plastic items, how they can impact our local waterways and literally have trickle-down effects on our global water systems. And our recent school programs, we have worked with kindergarten through 5th grade students to help them explore the possible ways that plastic in our community could end up in other parts of the world, using our Life of a Plastic Bottle interactive storyboard, which is shown on the left of the screen there. It helps students to really discuss these possibilities, these pretty, large scale concepts at, a more tangible level for them to have those conversations. So through pledge commitments to reduce the use of single-use plastics, coupled with our watershed education, we're trying to promote daily behavior changes that can have planet-wide impacts. If you'd like to learn more about us at Heritage Conservancy and ways that you can join us, visit our website. And for any students or early career professionals, we do still have a Delaware River Watershed Fellowship position open until April 13th. So if you're interested, please go on our website, and I can even drop that in the chat here in a moment, and sign up for that, submit your application. We have a few full-time positions and a lot of volunteer opportunities, including a cleanup and a habitat work day that's coming up this Saturday for an early Earth Day activity. So with that, I will pass it over to Diane.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to DelVal for inviting us to co-sponsor. We are primarily an education-driven nonprofit organization. Our main goal is to connect people with the natural world through education, engagement, involvement. We teach from preschoolers through to senior citizens about all aspects of the natural world, including but not limited to birds. We are an Audubon chapter. We've been an Audubon chapter since 1969. And we are also part of the Delaware River Basin. We have our own little watershed. The Honey Hollow watershed was designated a National Historic Landmark because it was a location where landowners got together to protect their natural resources without regard to artificial divisions of property lines. So they got together on a watershed-wide basis, and it was the first place in the nation where that occurred for a small watershed. So we are recognized for that. We have a lovely location. We've got trails that you can come hiking on. We do allow people with leashed dogs to come on our trails, as long as you clean up after them. And we welcome you to come hike on our trails anytime dawn to dusk. Next slide. Reg, may I have my next slide?
I'm trying. There we go.
There we go. So we are very excited, and I'm sorry that it conflicts with Shannon's cleanup, but we are very excited that we're having our Earth Day Festival this Saturday from 10 to 3. It's free. We have a marvelous lineup of activities, a whole slate of vendors. There's people that are doing advocacy. We do, in addition to education, we do advocacy. We write letters to the editor. We talk with our local legislators. We talk with the legislators in Harrisburg. And we have been supportive of single-use plastic bans in the surrounding community. So we do lots of things that involve that. We also have activities for children when they're out of school. So if any of you have school-age children or school-age grandchildren that want to come while parents are working, spring break this year is the 14th, 15th, and 18th. We will have 9 to 3 day camps for kids. And then in May, we've got 2 walks coming up, forest therapy in the morning and a spring wildflower walk in the afternoon. You can get more information about all of that at our website, and you see the website location there. So I hope to see some of you out this Saturday. Our activities are running from 10 to 3, so go pick up some trash with Shannon and then come on over and have some fun with us. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And before we hand this over to, oh, look at that. It's kind of backwards, isn't it? Interesting. Before I hand it over to Shannon to introduce Erica, I wanted to show you the book, but it kind of came across kind of odd. The book is available for Island Press with a 30% discount. So I have put in the chat the link to that and just put in the promo code webinar. Thank you, Shannon. I'm going to bring Erica's presentation up while you are giving the intro.
Great. And Diane, there's no shortage of great things this Saturday because we'll have a table at your Earth Day Festival as well. So we'll be around, and Audubon has the great things to do as well. So lots of fun stuff on Saturday this weekend. So it's with great pleasure that I get to introduce Erica Cirino. She is the communications manager of the Plastic Pollution Coalition. She has spent the last decade working as a science writer, author, and artist, exploring the intersection of the human and non-human worlds. Erica is best known for her widely published photojournalistic works that cut through plastic industry misinformation and injustice to deliver the often shocking and difficult truths about this most ubiquitous and insidious material. This includes her recent book, Thicker Than Water: The Quest for Solutions to the Plastic Crisis, in which she documents plastic across ecosystems and elements, shares stories from the primarily Black, Brown, Indigenous, and rural communities that are disproportionately harmed by industrial pollution globally, and uncovers strategies that work to prevent plastic from causing further devastation to our planet and its inhabitants. Erica lives with her human partner and rescued street dog, Sabi, hopefully I said that all right, when she's not communicating messages about the plastic crisis, pollution, solutions, justice, and systemic change. Erica can be found trail running, making art from microplastic, reading books, and sailing. And I'm about halfway through Erica's book right now, and she's certainly providing some unique perspectives and presenting the material in a way that, I haven't heard it or thought about it. So I've been thoroughly enjoying it, and I'm eager to hear from Erica more in this presentation. With that, I will pass it over to Erica Cirino.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much, all of you, for joining tonight. I'm just delighted to chat about my book and a material that has come to consume every day of my life now, which is plastic. And it is also a material that connects all of us. I'm sure no matter where you're sitting now, chances are you can name at least 5 to 10 plastic items around you. Plastic is literally everywhere. It's now also known that plastic is inside of humans. This week, news was published about several scientific studies revealing that there's now plastic in human blood and in human lungs. So these are really concerning findings. There's more and more now being found as more attention is turned to this issue. But I'm going to talk to you tonight and tell you the story of how I came to understand this issue and some of the insights that I included in my book. And hopefully this will be a great way to share these insights in a digestible and easy to understand way that also empowers you to take solutions into your own hands. So I just hope that for all the difficult and sometimes shocking and disturbing things that you might learn tonight, there are solutions, there are people working on them, but we all must be part of the change. But I don't want anyone to feel too down from all of this. I think that we should also celebrate and highlight a lot of the amazing progress that's been made. And now the issue of plastic is on everyone's tongues, it seems. And I think that that's just thanks to all the amazing work of the people you will hear more about tonight. And so with that, Reg, would you mind advancing a slide, please? So like many of you, maybe you can think about your own encounters with the plastic crisis. But my story and my understanding of it really started where a lot of people's relationship with plastic, I think, seems to begin, which is understanding plastic as a marine issue or an issue affecting the oceans. When I was growing up, well, just for context, I'm turning 30, so I'm 29 at the moment. When I was growing up in the 90s and early aughts, I was taught plastic is an issue of litter, of people not cleaning up at the beach, or of people just not being careful and not recycling. So it was never really well understood why plastic was the problem when it was people causing it. It just seemed like it was always blamed on those of us, which is pretty much all of us, who use plastic. And that issue is really problematic, and part of my effort to understand the problem in its entirety was actually to go to that place and see, what is the issue of plastic in the ocean actually all about? Is it this matter of litter, or is it something different? And so I chose to go to one of the most storied oceanic repositories of plastic waste, and that is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And so please advance. I sailed with Danish sailors and scientists more than 3,000 nautical miles from LA to Honolulu, Hawaii. And this was in 2016. At this time in the media, much of the news about plastic was still centered on plastic as an ocean issue. However, there was more talk of perhaps recycling is not effective, and there was some questioning of solutions. So as mentioned in my biography, I do work to cut through misinformation, and it turns out a lot of what we've been taught about plastic is not accurate, including what I'm about to show you, which is what the garbage patch actually looks like. So please move forward a slide. So we sailed through this area, and what's known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is actually an oceanic vortex that's spinning trash and other debris counterclockwise in the Pacific Ocean. And so this is a very strong ocean current, and there are several ocean currents like this throughout the world. And so instead of a floating dump of garbage, which the media tended to describe the garbage patch as, these are what these gyres, which tend to carry a lot of trash, these garbage patches actually look like. And so, Reg, if you don't mind advancing one more slide, you'll see that these are just kind of items and collections of items or fragments of items that pass by. So in this image, you'll see a tangle of fishing nets. In that previous image, that was a piece of a fishing crate. So there's a lot of fishing material and fishing gear out there. But the majority of items in the oceans and everywhere are actually items that were used on land just once or twice before being thrown away. And these are what we call single-use plastics. But that doesn't mean that this fishing gear is not harmful. This is actually extremely harmful stuff and entangles hundreds of thousands of marine creatures every single year, often fatally. And I recently learned that scientists are now trying to understand what kind of mental trauma, in addition to physical trauma, do wild animals suffer when they get entangled in these so-called ghost nets that keep catching and killing wildlife. And just to be clear, as you can see, this is a huge tangle of different types of nets. So in this spinning oceanic vortex, the trash tends to find each other, and these nets and ropes and different types of gear are really sticky and they kind of clump together. Often you'll find animals living in these conglomerate nets and ropes. And in fact, we scooped this one onto the ship while we were crossing because we knew that it would at least prevent maybe one animal from becoming entangled. Though this is a growing and serious problem that is, obviously not going to be solved by removing it net by net. However, we need to transform the way that we fish and the way that we, tap the oceans for resources. And that also means not overfishing. Commercial fishing is one of the key drivers of lost fishing gear in the oceans because these huge ships have poor accountability of the items on board, are often losing things over the side of the ship or have gear that's so large that it can become dislodged and then pose a giant risk to marine life. So it is a huge kind of systemic shift that we need in this arena. And as you'll see throughout this presentation, multiple arenas if we want to address the plastic issue from a holistic and equitable standpoint. So next slide, please. Here's another piece of a fishing crate. We'd often see items float by, as I said, either in fragments or in whole items. Sometimes it was fishing gear, but plastic is super problematic in the oceans and everywhere else because it does not benignly degrade like other materials, say wood, plant matter, and other materials like that. But plastic is a polymer and it's made from fossil fuels. So we're talking about mostly natural gas, but also sometimes oil. And once plastic is made, these bonds that make the molecular bonds do not easily break apart. And so this makes it very difficult to find a way to get rid of plastic. And in fact, there is no good place to get rid of plastic because it does not disappear. And so once plastic enters the oceans, it'll begin a process of breaking up into smaller pieces. Next slide, please. And so now you can see that these are all different kind of colorful little particles, and spoiler alert, most of them are plastic, not all of them. We did go through that sieve and we noticed that a lot of these particles were actually shells or maybe small pieces of plankton, but all those larger like rigid colored items that you see, those are plastic. And to collect these plastic items, the scientists were pulling trawl nets and different types of sampling equipment through the water throughout the Pacific Ocean and throughout the garbage patch to try to understand what's the concentration of these small plastic particles in the ocean, because it's one thing to have large plastic items, but to have these tiny particles is a whole nother ballgame. Because these particles themselves are so small that they can easily be ingested by marine wildlife. So this issue is only beginning to kind of emerge in the maybe around 2009, 2010. But in fact, scientists knew of this issue of plastic particles in the ocean from the 1960s. And that was something I learned through an investigation I did of the plastic crisis to understand what was the scientific alarm and what level of alarm has there been historically. And I learned that a lot of scientists have actually been silenced by the plastics industry or were threatened with their jobs. One scientist in particular, Edward Carpenter at the University of San Francisco, said that working at Woods Hole, he was one of the earliest scientists to publish information about plastic particles in the ocean, said that he was not offered tenure at his job. And a big reason of that was the intimidation by the plastic industry to his superiors. So there are real implications to the plastic crisis, and they're so wide ranging And it's so nuanced, but a big driver that you'll see and a big pattern that you'll see is the industry has this kind of playbook that they go by to either minimize the perceived threat of the problem, delay action, or kind of like obfuscate information, create misinformation, and also lead people towards false solutions. So keep all of this in mind as I kind of pick through these findings. But again, we're looking at these small particles of plastic, and they will always be plastic. They will just get smaller and smaller. And so consider all the different types of wildlife in the oceans, and they're all different sizes, from a blue mussel to a blue whale. And these are both filter feeding animals, and both of them can and do ingest microplastic particles. And some animals, like these filter feeders, can't do much about it. So when they take in water, they also take in plastic. That's something to be very concerned about. Next slide. And so why is this plastic, which scientists commonly refer to as microplastic, and the smaller size range known as nanoplastic, why is it so problematic? Well, that's because plastic itself is filled with all different types of chemicals, and I'll get more into that a bit later when I discuss findings in the lab. But while we were sailing, we found so much microplastic, particularly in the garbage patch. And again, that's due to those ocean currents pushing it there. And microplastic is not static. In fact, it's found ubiquitously, as previously mentioned, across the planet. But it's just to be clear, it's found in air, in soil, in our food, in animals, in our own bodies, in the oceans, fresh waterways, even outer space. And so we're just talking about, not to be just making light of it, but it is literally everywhere, and we don't quite know what it's doing, or the full extent, at least, of what it's doing to the planet, to animals, and to humans. So just at this time, we've kind of entered a new geological age, because if we look everywhere on the planet, from the highest mountain peak to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, we will find plastic. And that was not the case just over 100 years ago. So really a remarkable shift, and a remarkable example of how humans can really shape the planet, and not necessarily in a good way. So that's where we are now. Where I took this photo was on a beach called Camilo Beach, and that was on the Big Island of Hawaii. So after we had sailed through the garbage patch, the scientists had collected their findings on how much microplastic was in that area of the ocean, and to understand, the scale of the problem there. But then when we got to the Big Island of Hawaii, we also found that there was a big issue with trash washing up on the beach there, because it kind of jutted out into the garbage patch. So there's also a phenomenon of, some areas of the world, some parts of the oceans having like kind of hot spots of plastic. And that's also something scientists need to continue studying, because, it's going to cause injustice, and worse injustice in some places than others, of disproportionate amounts of pollution. And sometimes it's just based on something like geography. So next slide, please. This is a sad photo for anyone, especially people who love dogs. So this is just for context and kind of scale. So this beach, it's also a great example, by the way, of showing you how plastic just breaks up instead of breaks down. So again, what you see in the water, all those light pieces of plastic, those have been items that have been churned up. So this could be anything from a plastic bag to a bottle to a shampoo bottle. I'm just thinking of every plastic item that you could think of, clothing, etc., cars. So it's going to be churned up at some point into these small pieces, whether that's because of wind, waves, wildlife, in the oceans, plankton, and bacteria and viruses have been known to colonize pieces of plastic, and that seems to actually speed the breakup of the plastic items. Also, heat and sunlight are major drivers of this kind of breakup effect. So naturally in the oceans, there's a lot of microplastic, because this plastic that gets there is constantly being exposed to these very severe type of elements, especially on a coastline where there's constant churning. So, meanwhile, we have microplastic spreading everywhere. But why is there plastic getting into the ocean? That was still a question the scientists were trying to answer while I was with them. But these microplastic particles did offer some clues. So next slide, please. Just another shot of this beach. Again, as I mentioned, I just wanted to give context of how polluted this beach was. And all these items here, as they break up into microplastic, they have serious consequences for wildlife health and human health as well. But one kind of, I would say, unexpected consequence that scientists didn't account for, besides the toxic effects of plastic, which I'll get into a bit later, but when these plastic particles begin to accumulate on beaches and plastic items begin to accumulate on beaches, plastic actually heats up sand quite rapidly, and it holds heat better than sand. And so it's been changing the temperature along with, the climate crisis accelerating. But it's increasing the temperature of beaches, of the surface temperature, and that's causing sea turtle eggs to be slightly feminized, increasingly feminized actually. And so year after year, we're seeing populations of sea turtles due to this temperature effect. It turns out that warmer temperatures of sand create conditions for more eggs to hatch female than male. And so because the temperatures of the sand are increasingly out of balance with the temperatures of our atmosphere, but also because of this plastic, we're really seeing an effect that could cause extinctions. We don't know how all of this microplastic accumulating will affect the chemistry of the planet. There's big concern and real concern that plankton are dying because of microplastic, and plankton are critical for the carbon cycle in the oceans that helps us sequester carbon from our climate. And so you can see how these effects, again, we're talking about One Health. I think plastic is such a perfect topic for One Health discussions, but it is really so interconnected with everything plastic. And so when we're looking at, what is the real story here? Well, we can start to simply see that, the recycling narrative that industries have told us is the solution. How often, again, were we told, oh, this is a matter of littering, this is a matter of people not caring. And in reality, it's a problem of industries making a substance that people shouldn't really be using, and definitely should not be just simply disposing of. I can tell you that this beach, Camilo Beach, is super remote. Few people actually go there besides locals and those going to clean the beach. I actually went with a nonprofit group called Hawaii Wildlife Fund, and they do weekly cleanups. And none of this plastic was actually dropped by anyone visiting the beach. This is all plastic that's washed up from elsewhere in the world, specifically from that garbage patch. So how that plastic got there, again, tracing our way back to land, I started out in the sea and came back to understand where exactly that was all coming from. Next slide, please. Just showing you a scene of, again, the fatalities to wildlife. This is a parrotfish, but there was simply a lot of deceased animals where there was plastic, and a lot of the plastic on this beach was actually marked with Japanese characters, and sometimes the date of maybe, say, on a fishing crate of when a shipment was collected or sent out. And this was also debris from the 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan. And it really was another example showing the widespread of plastic and how interconnected it is with Earth's natural systems. And so simply this natural disaster and the tides brought an influx of plastic into the Pacific, and specifically to Hawaii. Next slide, please. Here is an albatross, a young albatross actually, and this photo was taken by Chris Jordan whom I sailed with across the garbage patch. And wildlife, so we talked about entanglements a bit earlier, but wildlife are also ingesting plastic particles and items at alarming rates. And it's not necessarily that they, think that the piece of plastic is food, though in some cases it might appear to be food. But wildlife also seem to be smelling plastic, and that triggers kind of a reaction for them to eat it. Scientists are still trying to understand the nuances of that. But for anyone concerned about wildlife, which should be all of us, this is a really horrific image to see. And it also raises the question, like, how is this creature getting all this plastic in their bodies, plastic that, it looks like should be in a garbage can? And this is like, again, this question that's been troubling people for a long time, including the scientists that I'd sailed with. But what came to light was that actually most of this plastic is ending up in the ocean because there's no good way to contain it. And now that we see the consequences of it, there's this point where we've kind of have to have a discussion of what will we do about it. So next slide, please. And so if wildlife getting sick and dying is not enough to convince you that we should do something, I'm going to add another anecdote here. This is from when we sailed across the garbage patch. We had caught several fish while at sea, and one of the mahi-mahi, when we cut open the stomach, which we were doing routinely to try to check for plastics, we did find plastics. And so these are two small plastic particles you can see on the left side of the screen. And that's the mahi-mahi fish on the right side, otherwise known as a dolphin fish. And out at sea, we live a very simple life, particularly on this boat that I was sailing on at the time called Christianshavn. If you read my book, you can get the whole story, but it's a very simple ship. And when we kind of made our rations in the boat, we had a lot of like long-lasting food, so a lot of beans, a lot of rice, a lot of pasta, and it gets a little boring after a while. So when you get fresh food, it's really quite a treat. But your appetite, or at least my appetite, dwindled a bit when I learned that there were plastic particles in the stomach of the fish that we were about to eat. And so plastic particles, just like plastic items, are produced with a whole array, any combination of hundreds of thousands of chemicals. And these are everything from additives that change the color of the plastic to chemicals that affect its consistency, flexibility, ability to absorb UV light or sunlight, in addition to flame retardant properties. And a lot of these properties are super helpful. I mean, like a lot of these things are useful to people. Water resistance is another one, non-stick pans. I'm just coming up with all the different combinations in my head as I'm thinking, but I could go on and on, literally. But a lot of these chemicals, many of which are derived also like plastics from fossil fuels, are highly toxic and can have horrible effects on human and non-human endocrine or hormone systems, contribute to development of cancers, respiratory problems, skin problems. I mean, I can go on and on. There are so many different chemicals that could cause so many different issues. And in my book, I go into much more detail than I will tonight because we have limited time. But with that said, this is a major component of the plastic crisis, besides environmental and wildlife health, besides this plasticine that we've created, and knowing that plastic particles are harming wildlife, they're also harming our health. And that's something that we need to pay really special attention to. As I mentioned previously, that just this week, there's been news that plastic has been found in human blood and in human lungs. This is quite concerning, again, though not surprising when we look at the fact that, as in this example, plastic is in the food that we eat. Fish in particular, this is a huge concern as the oceans, rapidly fill with plastic. A lot of people, billions around the world, rely on fish to survive. And if we don't have this food source, there are a lot of people that will be missing a major part of their diet that they cannot live without. So we need to really protect what we need to rely on to survive. And I think emphasizing that point is always a good idea. So I'm doing it now. Next slide, please. This is just a quick shot of me in the lab. I was taking a close look at the plastic particles that we had collected in the ocean with one of the scientists who was aboard the ship with us. And his name is Christian Suberg, and he's at Roskilde University in Denmark. And so I spent quite a lot of time with him looking at these particles and trying to trace their route back to land and to understand where they really came from. So we used a technology, which I detail further in my book, and several other technologies as well. But there are different ways that materials science can lend insights into plastic pollution research, because you can study what each particle, these individual tiny little pieces of plastic, and some of these pieces are smaller than your pinky nail, very, very small pieces of plastic. You can kind of trace their provenance. So when you put these in a machine called an FTIR machine, a ray of light sends a wavelength back at you when it hits this material. So that's a very, very simplified way of explaining what happens. But essentially, you get a wavelength, because light is a wavelength, read back to you from this machine, and it indicates what kind of plastic you might have. So there are many different types of plastic. You might look at plastic item and see a number on it. That is a rough guide to what type of plastic you're holding in your hand. Not every item has this code on it. This is called a resin code. It does not mean the item is recyclable. It means this is just the number of the type of plastic that you have. So we have low density polyethylene. That's like your plastic bag, sometimes plastic bottles. Plastic bottles are often also made from PET, which is a slightly more recyclable plastic, though I'll get into a bit later. Recycling, there are a lot of issues with it that we have to discuss. And I won't go through everything right now because I see that we're a little tight on time, but in any case, there are many different types of plastics out there, and to understand which items are getting into our environment by, understanding which particles we're seeing, can shed a little bit of light sometimes into, where there might be a need for laws or regulations. And that's one of the many, many solutions, systemic solutions, by the way, that we need to this crisis. And that is to understand, should we ban a certain type of plastic item because we're finding a lot of these items and particles in our environment. That has been shown definitely to help. In 2015, for example, the US passed a law banning microbeads, which were these tiny plastic spheres that were found in waterways all around the world, and particularly in US waterways. So in 2015, President Obama signed a law that banned the microbeads. So they've been phased out of cosmetics and pharmaceutical items. And that has largely been seen as a success, but it needs to be global. It can't just be country by country as it is now. Next slide, please. I'm just emphasizing, and again, some of the issues with plastic. We do breathe it in. Another thing that I learned in Denmark by going to a different laboratory at Aalborg University, which is another town in Denmark. These scientists were studying how microplastic might be traveling through the air, and it turns out we're breathing in plastic both in our indoor and outdoor air. And they learned that by using this very funny looking mannequin. But I just like to bring up the fact that, it's this chemical danger, and it's also a physical danger, because plastic particles are probably accumulating in different parts of our bodies, including, as kind of confirmed this week in the scientific news, our lungs. And rates of asthma and respiratory problems appear to be going up. There are many different possible explanations for that, but one of the possibilities that scientists are now looking into is certainly plastic particles. Next slide. So where are we now? we're kind of diving through the misinformation, leaning towards solutions. We've heard that regulation can help. Also, but what about recycling? I'm going to bring us back to this point. As you can see, trash, especially plastic trash, is very lightweight. It's very hard to contain. So even when we do put it in the right place, as we are told to do, it often gets into our natural environment. It's estimated that up to 80% of, at least 80% of all plastic enters the environment or is landfilled. And that's a huge number, a huge amount of plastic. And so a huge number of plastic items that are put in our recycling bins never actually are recycled. And that is part of the misinformation and kind of obfuscation that the industry has been playing into, because there really is no good place to put plastic. And as you can see, putting it at the side of the road is not really a very clean or effective or well-managed kind of solution to the problem. Next slide. So globally, since the 1940s, when plastics were first mass produced, only 9%, and now it's closer, like at this current level, 4% of all plastics ever made have been recycled. That is a tiny, tiny number. And again, most plastics are ending up in the natural environment. And so what actually does happen when we put something into a recycling bin? Well, it's either sent to a landfill, it's incinerated in some cases, it leads to its own climate and human health problems and environmental injustice problems as well, I have to add. And I'll talk more about environmental injustice in a bit. But I'll show you the next slide. A lot of our plastic waste is also shipped overseas, particularly in the US and other wealthy nations that produce a lot of trash, the US being the world's top plastic waste and waste generally producing country in the world. So this is another type of environmental injustice. It's also referred to as waste colonialism, whereas wealthier nations ship waste to less wealthy nations that are given money to accept this waste that they cannot recycle, but the wealthy nations can say that they recycled the waste. So it's a legal loophole, also something that's increasingly, thankfully, being called out and addressed through the work of groups like Gaia, the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives. They've worked a lot on issues related to waste colonialism. Also, my group, Plastic Pollution Coalition, is involved in efforts like that too, to bring this issue to light. Next slide, please. On the thread of environmental injustice, I also mentioned that, a lot of the plastic is actually sent to landfills. So this is the Brookhaven Landfill in North Bellport, New York. I'm from Long Island, New York originally, and North Bellport is about an hour from where I had been living on Long Island for most of my life. And I also was living for part of my time on Long Island in a community with an incinerator. And that incinerator sent toxic ash, to this landfill. So this landfill has been closed to accepting municipal solid waste for some years now, but it still accepts construction and demolition debris and toxic ash from this incinerator. And it has huge health consequences on the surrounding community. And the surrounding community happens to be primarily Black and Indigenous. And I think that in terms of placement and the idea that the town is allowing this, it just seems unbelievable at this point, as the community has repeatedly drawn attention to the issue of the landfill being allowed to remain open despite clear signs of pollution and clear signs of health consequences on the surrounding community, including an incident with sewage sludge being shipped to the landfill and an entire school needing to be evacuated. And that school, again, is primarily people of color and Indigenous people. And I think the population of the community has made it very clear to their local lawmakers that this is unacceptable, and the local lawmakers keep very clearly dismissing the community's concerns, and it is increasingly hostile, I mean, in terms of the reactions that the community is getting. And it's a very unfortunate, but very common, unfortunately, situation, because there's so many communities all over the world facing similar situations of waste piling up in their communities, and these racist government systems just simply refusing to help and refusing to actually be held accountable, or hold themselves accountable. However, the communities are leading the change. And I have a few articles out about North Belport and about this amazing group called BLARG, Brookhaven Landfill Action Remediation Group, that is leading their own change, because they recognize, as we should all recognize, that the solution to the plastic crisis is to turn off the tap. And we cannot be making this material in a world that cannot accept it, because there's no such place as a way. There's always just somewhere else, and that someone else is usually a person of color's backyard, and that's just a world that we shouldn't have. And so that's for another time. I mean, we're running out of time here, but I could talk about environmental justice for hours and hours, and it's just such an important part of the story that I can't leave out. So next, please. I'm going to ask you, Reg, to just scroll through the next 3 slides, please. And everyone's getting a view now of what's the so-called Cancer Alley in Louisiana. And so I mentioned that petrochemical industry and the plastics industry are strongly related. They are connected. They fuel each other, essentially. And there are frontline communities, again, primarily Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities on the front lines of this crisis due to the effects of systemic racism. And luckily, many communities are now being heard as allies, and others increasingly step aside and give a voice and give platforms to these communities that have long been underrepresented and underserved. So we see a positive trend in this direction, but there's an urgent need to keep amplifying our environmental justice heroes. And the woman wearing that yellow shirt in the middle ground of this photo is Sharon Levine, and she won a Goldman Prize last year for her amazing work with Rise St. James. And she held back 2 plastic factories so far from being built in her community in St. James, Louisiana. And St. James already has 12 highly toxic, highly polluting, and highly dangerous petrochemical and plastics infrastructure developments throughout their community. And they've been linked to a lot of health problems and a lot of accidents, including fires and explosions and other issues that are extremely detrimental to the community's physical, mental health, and just general well-being. And so, next slide, please. Community members can and are acting. And I think that's another really important thing to emphasize, is that to address this crisis, we all should be involved in our communities, and we all have to hold our representatives accountable to represent our best interests. And that includes the health and safety of all people. And so different tactics used by these groups include, showing up at town meetings and town hearings, just being aware of legislation on the table, calling representatives, writing letters, signing petitions, having protests. There's so many ways to be involved, and it really can just require, having an open mind and being able to tap into your, I'll call it like your so-called superpower. So if you're really good at connecting people or educating people, talking to neighbors, you can do many things to help bring attention to the crisis and to address the systemic change that we need. Next slide. So fundamentally, what do we need? A value change. Again, so what kind of world do we want and what do we need? We are sold and distracted by plastic. I mean, it is all around us, and we are constantly working to buy more plastic stuff and more stuff generally. And a lot of the stuff that we buy, if we take a look at it, has been part of this industrial capitalist system and colonial system. And it is not stuff that is helping people. In effect, it is actually hurting many, many people, and often our most vulnerable people. And so these are questions that really hit me coincidentally out at sea when I was living so simply on that sailboat. And I think it's just a really good lesson that also applies when thinking about the plastic crisis. And it was what really led me to write this book that we're talking about tonight, Thicker Than Water. So I'm gonna have ask everyone please to ponder these questions when you leave tonight, but I'll fly through the next few slides. Reg, can we move forward? Thank you. Again, what kind of world do we want? Do we need? Do we want a plastic world or a plastic-free world? Next slide, please. To get people to care, I often create artwork. This first image on the left is a female body with a fetus inside. And I created that after I learned that there is microplastic, these little plastic particles found now on both sides of the human placenta. So both mothers and fetuses can have plastic pass back and forth, and very likely the toxic chemicals along with plastic. So huge concern. That's just a photograph of a hand grasping for plastic. But these are, a different media of communication. And I try to really, test the boundaries and push different people to view the issue in different ways. And I think that we can challenge our culture and challenge our perception when we really think about the consequences in these more emotional ways. Next slide, please. And Reg, if you just want to go through the next few, please, that would be great. I'm just going to show you the art that I do with young people. So this is, how do we educate? How do we empower? I have young people doing science and art and beach cleanups. Beach cleanups are not the solution. We can't clean up all the plastic out there, but we can make art out of it. We can consider the consequences of it. We can study it. And I'll leave you with that URL. You'll find a lot more about plastic on my website. And I hope if we don't have time for all the questions that you'll reach out to me. There's contact information there as well. Thanks so much.
And we do have some questions, Erica. So our first one is from Claire. That was a great presentation, by the way. I'm sure that there will be several questions here. If it's an industry level problem, how do we get industries to stop using this toxic material? How do we push our representatives to outlaw these materials?
It's such a good question. And there are many different ways that we should be doing that. But first of all is just to, again, be involved in your own community. If you can start there, you can sometimes even implement that maybe small scale systemic change, like maybe getting your entire school to go plastic free, or your entire town. I've even seen several friends of mine actually live in what are called plastic free towns, which is really exciting. But we really need the fossil fuel industry to stop producing fossil fuels for use, especially for use to be turned into plastic. And that is just a very, very unfortunate reality for those industries. And by pushing for a plastics treaty, which thankfully thousands and thousands of people and businesses and diverse number and diverse types of people and groups have been in support of, showing their support of the plastics treaty. And in response, the UN actually has prioritized the creation of such a treaty over the next 2 years. But it's critical that people continue to educate themselves and really embody the change that we need to see, and not fall for industry misinformation, and really take a step forward in thinking, what world do I want to create or be a part of? And part of that is recognizing these really deep and grave systemic issues and the urgent need to address them. From environmental injustice to the climate crisis, everything about plastic is extremely urgent. So those are the systems changes that we need. And again, political involvement, there are different levels of it. But I would always encourage, just start in your community and see where it goes from there. I think that you'll find that you can, quickly gain ground.
Kind of bounce back and forth here. We had some in chat and some in Q&A. We had Ryan said, excellent presentation, Erica.
Thank
And
you.
then we had Marjorie said, how can we get producers and grocers to use less packaging?
Great question. Actually, my new employer, Plastic Pollution Coalition, has put together a guide on the website, which I can, let me see if I can get it now, or if not, I can send it to anyone who's interested. But there are so many different ways. And I think the first thing is to ask yourself a question of, what actually needs packaging and what does not. There are tons of refill and reuse shops kind of cropping up everywhere that I look, which is a really nice thing to see. But it's easy to see when you buy in bulk and then create dispensable systems for different types of foods. In my local grocery store, for example, there's even, an olive oil dispenser, like from a big tub. There are different ways to get around having packaging. So encouraging people to bring their own bags is one very small start, but also to get into this system of creating a reuse or refill shop, I think is really amazing, or where you could return bottles or jars filled with some kind of grocery item and then get it washed and refilled. Like, that's the kind of world that we need to build. And it is happening. Again, as I said, there are shops like this that do exist. And online on the Plastic Pollution Coalition's website, there is a guide suggesting how businesses can go plastic free. But it's going from eliminating plastic straws and packaging and all different types of utensils. There's a lot of different single-use plastics involved in stores and especially eateries. And so I think it's just asking a lot of questions of like, why do I need this? You look at the item and think about it in that way. And there are a lot of alternatives, especially refillables and reusables.
Well, speaking of alternatives, Tabitha asked, would switching to a more biodegradable plastic, like plastic made out of hemp, help this issue, or will it just continue adding to the dire situation?
That's a great question. So again, the gold standard is just to have no packaging. We don't want waste. Waste is something that nature does not naturally create. And so plastic is kind of defying the mold here because it lasts forever. And so a lot of these bioplastics we're finding now are not actually great. It's very hard to regulate them because there's not one kind of body that does that. And a lot of the bioplastics that scientists have looked at independently in laboratories actually have a lot of the same chemicals that are found in plastic, a lot of those nasty substances that we don't want in the environment or in our bodies. And so for that reason, bioplastics are best to stay away from. And it's really optimal to kind of move towards only any kind of material that could, truly biodegrade and truly be non-toxic. So for example, in Southeast Asia, I've seen a lot just, simply a banana leaf wrapped around a piece of food. So that is still going to be creating some type of waste, but luckily that could be used for compost and be completely benign, whereas bioplastics might not be that benign. So it's kind of like buyer beware right now.
Another question from Claire. We've been told for years it can be recycled, but now we know it mostly can't. Is there any ecological and sustainable way to rid the planet of the plastic waste? I heard about some experiments with plastic eating bacteria, but are solutions like that just a pipe dream?
That's a great question too. Yeah, there's been a lot of news about plastic eating enzymes and microbes in the past few years. And right now, there's no clear answer as to whether or not that would actually be successful. There's first that question that came into my mind was like, what would happen if these enzymes escaped? And several scientists expressed to me that they could evolve on their own, but in a widespread manner. If say something really powerful got out there, what if all the plastic in the world just started melting away? That would be not a great thing. So it's just it is kind of like we would call it like industry misinformation or messaging that it's kind of something that the industry has used to push the solution off. And so they've embraced the idea of enzymes because even though they're not really an immediate solution, it seems like that's something that's high tech and could solve the problem. But right now there's no proof that that would be effective, if that answers the question.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Madison asks, is there any organization or association that tries to go out and physically pull out any plastic they find in the ocean that you know of?
I know lots of organizations that do that, but what comes to mind on a larger scale is a project referred to as the Ocean Cleanup. And Boyan Slat, who is a Dutch inventor, created this giant oceanic boom, and now a whole fleet of these different types of garbage collection devices. There are also trash collecting boats that are deployed in the oceans and in waterways, but these are really only treating the symptom of the problem, which is like cleaning up plastic. More than 350 million metric tons, which is like just an enormous number of plastic items, are produced every year, and most of these are sorry, not most of them, but 40% of them are single use, and most of them will end up in the environment or in landfills. And so yeah, it's just a growing problem, a big problem, and yeah, we need to act now to address it.
I'm going to take a couple of more questions here. So Mary basically is asking, what are your thoughts on drinking water? With plastics, essentially nanoplastics and microplastics being everywhere, what's the future of drinking water?
Another great question. It's definitely kind of a delicate situation, and for many reasons. Some of them are linked to plastic particles themselves. Others are linked to PFAS and other dangerous chemicals found in plastic, because we have both of these dangers now. And they're both interrelated with one another. So plastics have chemicals in them, but also can leach chemicals out into, for example, water sources, soils, etc. So we ingest plastic particles because our pipes, many of our pipes are made out of PVC, which is a type of plastic. But people who drink out of plastic water bottles ingest more plastic particles than those who drink tap water, simply because those plastic bottles are flimsier plastic that breaks up into particles more easily. If these bottles are in the sun or in warm weather, it's going to be more particles. So it could be, I think the number was as many as 30,000 more plastic particles that you ingest per year if you drink bottled water. I have the statistic in my book, but it is astounding, and it is really frightening to think that, you know, even something that we need in our bodies could be polluted due to something that we're using, like our cell phone, or where the clothes that we wear, because most of the clothes that we wear are made out of plastic or synthetic material. So filters, you know, getting a good home filter is really great. Again, drinking tap water when possible, and really for our country and our world to prioritize the safety and health of drinking water, and also, of course, turn off the tap so that we stop having this problem. But it is going to keep happening. These particles can be so small that a filter cannot catch them. So that's the main concern.
And I was going to go just to one more question, but there's another one that kind of speaks to me as well. So from Anne, she says, when I was hospitalized a couple of years ago, I was appalled by the amount of plastic used every day. Obviously, hospitals need to have clean, sterile spaces. Do you know of any alternatives for plastics for healthcare facilities?
Oh, thank you for the question, Anne. I hope you're doing okay. Well, I'm not an expert in the healthcare field, but I will say that there are efforts that I've heard of recently, actually, of medical professionals who are pushing their individual institutions to go to a lower plastic model. And often that can be done in different ways that are kind of lower stakes. So eliminating single-use plastics, for example, in the food that patients are given, because meals are delivered 3 or more times a day. And different types of medical equipment, some of it does not need to be wrapped in plastic, or maybe not wrapped in so much plastic. And so many medical professionals are implementing these lower waste solutions in hospitals. But the push is actually growing, which is really cool to see. And I've just only recently read about this in the past few years. So these are new developments, and it's just so encouraging to see so many people pushing for change. It's really great.
And Ann asked about book information, and Ann, it is in the chat. If you go up towards scroll up to the top, it has a link to islandpress.org /books/thicker-water. And that will take you to the page to order the book. And then if you use promo code webinar, that will give you a 30% discount, thanks to Island Press. And finally, one last question from Anonymous. Do you sell your artwork?
I do. That's a very nice question. Yeah, if you're interested, please feel free to reach out. I sell photographs and also some of the other multimedia stuff. So yeah, thank you.
And with that, Erica, thank you. This is an excellent presentation. We had a great turnout. We're running a little bit late, but I think with the number of questions that we had and the number of questions that I couldn't get to, I think that you can certainly see that this is a topic of great interest to everybody. And we have been proud to have you our guest tonight. And again, thank you, and our sincere thanks to Island Press for helping to make this possible. I hope you and everybody have a great evening. And thank you, Shannon and Diane, for your organizations co-sponsoring this event.
Thank you. Such a pleasure. Take care, everyone. Good night.
Good night. Good night, everybody. Good night, Shannon and Diane.
Night. Thanks, Reg. That was a great presentation.
Thanks. It was a great turnout, too. So we will see you later.
Yeah, such an important subject, too. It's just amazing. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And so we'll see you for the last presentation, too, with Chris Gambino, right, Diane?
That's correct.
All right. You guys have a great night.
Have a good night. See you this weekend, Diane.
Yeah.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.